Hello, everyone. I'm here today in this live event hosted by the World Bank. Thank you for joining us as the World Bank presents its economic report for the region with growth estimates for Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is María Eloisa Capurro. I'm an economics reporter at Bloomberg News based in Latin America, and I'm joined by William Maloney, Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Thank you for joining us, Bill.
Hola, Luisa. How are you?
How are you? So I wanted to kick off this conversation talking a little bit about the accomplishments that Latin America has made as it exits the pandemic. The report focuses on low inflation and unemployment rates as signs that the region has overcome some of the worst economic impacts from the pandemic, but still the World Bank downgraded the region's growth estimate for this year to 1.6 from prior 2.3%. So I'm wondering why. What's behind this downgrade?
So to take the first part of your statement, that we need to recognize how relatively well the region has done both during the pandemic and after in both managing the shock of COVID, but then also managing the inflation afterwards. We didn't have a recession that was particularly worse than any other part of the region. And our inflation rates at, I think, 3.3% for the region as a whole are now below the OECD. And both of these reflect the professionalization of the macroeconomic policymakers in the region and of the institutions that make those policies. And we have to give the region credit for that evolution. Now, the downgrading you're seeing in our forecasts is mostly due to three big countries that did a little bit worse than we thought. Well, two that did a little bit worse, meaning Mexico and Brazil, and then Argentina is forecast to do a good deal worse than we expected, minus 2.6 or something percent. Just check that. Minus 2.8% for this year. If we take out Argentina from that calculus, we wind up at about 2.2%, which is not so different from our original forecasts.
Mm-hmm. Still, that's lower growth than previous years. So one thing the report also focuses on is these estimates and prospects of lackluster growth ahead in the region. And this is something we have discussed many, many times. The report says and describes the business structure as one with many self-employed businesses at the bottom and few small and medium firms at the top. So I'm wondering, how does this play into this lackluster growth that you see ahead? What are the results from this if we think about it in terms of investment?
So these two poles, this kind of bipolarity of the business structure in Latin America, where we have very large firms. For instance, the top 50 firms in Chile account for 70% of GDP. I mean, just hugely concentrated. And that's not unusual for the region. And on the other hand, we have roughly 70% of the workforce in firms of under 10. Those firms of under 10, there are very few Steve Jobs just waiting to become Apple Computer. Most of them are not high growth firms. They're not going to innovate very much. Most of them are headed by workers with incomplete secondary or secondary education at best. So we can't expect so much of them as locomotors of growth. So the report is focusing more on whether lack of competition is keeping the firms at the upper end, both from themselves improving and innovating and becoming more productive, but also preventing new modern firms from entering that would rejuvenate growth in the region.
Mm-hmm. And this also goes back at the need of governments to have in mind how the structure works when they do policy, right? And
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to understand that you're not dealing with a very equal and very dense, medium and large size firms across the industrial spectrum. It's mostly concentrated at two poles.
Then two new challenges that the report also poses for the region are a spike in crime and an aging population. I'm wondering if you could help us think of how these factors will play into growth estimates ahead.
Right. So both are likely to have provide challenges on the growth front. Right now, what we're seeing, we're accustomed to think of ourselves as a young continent, but it's not really true. Right now, we're getting to the point where the adult dependency ratio, the age dependency ratio, the number of old people per working person is steadily rising. And we've had a decline over time of the dependency ratio that's going to end at about 2027. And the dependency ratio, driven mostly by older people, is going to be rising going forward. And that's going to imply higher pension costs, higher health costs. It's also probably going to, obviously those people are leaving the workforce, but in addition, the people who tend to take care of these people tend to be women. So they'll probably be leaving the workforce too. So we're going to have both a squeeze on the fiscal side as we try to come up with the resources for health and pension responsibilities, and lower savings as a result, because old people are going to be drawing on their savings. Those won't be available for investment anymore. And at the same time, we'll have a reduction in the workforce. So that's going to be difficult.
And
on the other hand,
in terms of crime,
the crime issue is something that we've all known about for a while, but the fact that we're seeing particularly organized crime expanding to countries where we didn't see it much in the past, and then we've had some very tragic and high-profile incidents, for instance, in Ecuador, that are just highlighting how violent the region is. And if you look at as one measure of violence, the number of homicides per 100,000 people, we're about 10 times the level in Asia, about 5 times the level in North America. We're above what would be expected for our level of poverty and inequality. And this clearly has impacts on growth because it makes the environment uncertain, because it makes people unhappy, it makes people leave, makes firms say, well, I don't know, given a choice between working in Vietnam, where education achievement is much higher and it's nice and tranquil, or going to Latin America, where we're struggling to find qualified workforce, and we've got cartels to deal with, it makes us less attractive from the investment point of view, both foreign and domestic.
And this is something that the World Bank with other multilateral banks are going to study, right?
That's exactly right. So because we see this as a major issue, the IDB, the World Bank, and the CAF are combining resources to get first an analytical program going, which is let's understand the dimensions of this problem and understand what has worked in the past to combat it, and then hopefully to make policy recommendations once we know what we're saying.
To start to wrap up this conversation, Bill, but one last thing that I wanted to discuss with you. Brazil is this year leading G20 discussions and is placing the fight against inequality at center stage. I'm wondering if this, in your eyes, is enough to overcome some of the challenges that we discussed here today.
So obviously inequality is a longstanding issue for Latin America and in Brazil. I would say it can help us move in the right direction, depending on how we do it. We need to deal with the fact that our students are underachieving in schools, right? Ceará has a very successful case of raising test scores of kids in a very short period of time. All of Brazil should learn the lessons from that, I'm not sure. And all of the region can learn from that. But this is something, again, if you look at our competition, let's say Vietnam, for FDI, they managed to increase their test scores above the OECD levels in about 2 generations. We are still substantially below the level that would be expected for countries of our level of income. So to the degree that improves social mobility and improves income distribution, that will move in the direction of improving health, increasing growth, making us more attractive as investment destinations, and help income distribution. So that's a place to start.
And the report also focuses on this need for structural reforms in terms, for example, of education, how these reforms have been put off for many governments before.
Sure, and it's not just, I've been talking about basically secondary education, primary and secondary education, particularly in the public sector. Latin America is extremely good at educating its elites. It's the public education sector that really lags. But it's not just that. One thing that we highlight is in order for competition to actually stimulate more investment and more innovation by firms, the firms need to be capable and they need to be supported by institutions that help them compete. And one example is we have very good universities, some very good universities in Latin America, but we tie for last in the world in terms of the linkages between higher education and the private sector. So that and the fact that we tend to underinvest in engineers and scientific skills makes it so we don't have that synergy that you'd have, for instance, a Silicon Valley, or you find throughout Asia or throughout Scandinavia, where there's a tight linkage between a strong scientific and engineering establishment and the private sector. So we need to work on a set of incentives to change that interaction too. We can also talk about a shortage of what we would call in the United States, community colleges, or where you have técnicos y tecnológicos, as we would say in Colombia. Mm-hmm. We're missing that level of mid-level skilled people in Latin America as well. So we have an education challenge just across the spectrum, from primary education all the way to higher education and how it interacts with the private sector.
That's about
yes, of course. Put one final number on that, just to give you a feeling of roughly 29% of firms in Latin America say they can't expand for lack of qualified labor. Okay, the number in Asia is 10%. Okay, so this is a major barrier. So to the degree that you're going to work on improving income inequality through raising the skills of the poorest and of the lower middle class and all, I mean, that can really help make us more competitive as well.
No, but this is great because it goes also back to the question, and one of the focuses of the report, of the business structure and governments understanding how it really works and what is needed when they put the policies in place. But that's about all the time we have today. So I want to thank you, Bill, for sharing your thoughts with us, all of you for standing by, and also invite you all to read and comment on the report of the World Bank that is focused on competition as the missing ingredient for growth, and which will be shared across the bank's social media. Thank you all.
Mil gracias, Eloisa.